Hello, everybody. I'm Julie Wiskirchen from the Authors at Google team here in Santa Monica. And today I'd like to welcome Michael Hiltzik. Michael is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author who has covered business, technology, and public policy for the LA Times for 20 years. In that time, he has served as a financial and political writer, an investigative reporter, and as a foreign correspondent in Africa and Russia. He currently serves as the Times business columnist. He received the 1999 Pulitzer Prize for articles exposing corruption in the entertainment industry. His other books include Colossus, The Hoover Dam and the Making of the American Century, The Plot Against Social Security, Dealers of Lightning, Xerox PARC and the Dawn of the Computer Age, and A Death in Kenya. And today he's going to be speaking about his new book, which is called The New Deal, A Modern History. So please join me in welcoming Michael Hiltzik.
Well, thank you, Julie. Thanks for that introduction and the invitation. This is a great program, I know you've had a really wide variety of speakers over the months and years, so we're going to spend some time today, obviously, on history and its relevance to the modern day. And what I hope we'll have is sort of a mutual interactive effort this afternoon to look back at an important inflection point in American history and to explore how that moment still resonates today. So my goal this afternoon is the same as the goal I had when I started working on my book, which is to recover the New Deal from the mists of time and the accretion of 8 decades of ideology and misunderstanding and misrepresentation and sheer forgetfulness. And to talk about how what was an imaginative reinvention of the federal government is not only still relevant today, but quite possibly more relevant than it has been since its inception. About how it created the world that makes public investment an important partner of private enterprise in a way that profits all of us and ensures that the benefits of economic growth are shared fairly and evenly among all the contributors to that growth to help the country prosper. So I'd like to set the stage by quoting one of the most famous passages of Franklin Roosevelt's speeches, one in which he acknowledged the intense opposition that his efforts created, his efforts to challenge the status quo, and in which he made it clear that he was going to stand fast. This was from a speech that came at the end of his 1936 re-election campaign. One of the last speeches he gave before Election Day, and he stood up in Madison Square Garden in New York and said, "We've had to struggle with the old enemies of peace, business and financial monopoly, speculation, reckless banking, class antagonism, sectionalism, war profiteering," and you can hear, by the way, some of the things that still echo today. But he continued, "Never before in all our history have these forces been so united against one candidate as they are today. They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred." Now, it's hard to imagine a political leader today speaking so bluntly about his or her adversaries, but even in these days when we're supposed to believe that the level of public discourse has fallen as low as at any time in history, for a president to say anything more biting to his enemies than "bring it on" would generate a lot of indignation in the modern day. False indignation maybe, but there you are. But FDR's words on that occasion, I think, encapsulate the history of the New Deal in a way. They tell you a lot not only about Franklin Roosevelt, but about his principles and the position he held in the hearts of the voters, about the deep personal affinity that millions of Americans felt for someone who was, after all, a child of privilege, a product of a Harvard education, a man who had grown up with servants doing his bidding on a family estate in upstate New York. And it tells you something not only about his personality and how he projected the sense that he cared about Americans in all walks of life, and in all socioeconomic classes, but about the times, a unique period in our history when America had been beaten down by an economic crisis so lengthy and so crushing that even the wealthiest businessmen, most important business leaders, most experienced political leaders had thrown up their hands and declared in public that they had no answers. So Roosevelt arrived in the White House in March 1933, having declared quite candidly during his own election campaign that he didn't have the answers either, but that he was going to try everything he could to bring America out of this crisis. As he put it in a key speech during the campaign, the country needs, and unless I mistake its temper, the country demands bold, persistent experimentation. Whoops. Bold, persistent experimentation. It's common sense, he said, to take a method and try it. If it fails, admit it frankly and try another, but above all, do something. And he repeated that theme in his inauguration speech. The most famous line of that speech is his reassurance that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, but he backed that up by promising action and action now. And what he tried was an amazingly varied slate of programs. The New Deal closed the banks and reopened them days later under an unprecedentedly stringent set of new regulations. It sent hundreds of thousands of young men from city and countryside into the wilderness to clear brush and create parks and build roads. That was the Civilian Conservation Corps, the first work relief program of the New Deal that we know of as the CCC. The New Deal tossed out a mortgage system that required homeowners to refinance their loans every 3 to 5 years, preventing them from ever building up equity, and replaced it with the form of mortgages that we've come to know today, long-term loans that aim to help you eventually own your house, and loans which, by the way, the government financed at rock-bottom interest rates. This was the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC, which ended up turning a profit for the U.S. government. The New Deal implemented price supports for a farm sector that by 1933 had been in a depression not for 4 years, but for more than 10 years. It created Social Security. It took America off the gold standard, releasing the U.S. economy from the shackles of the past. And it built more than America had ever built before or has built since. Highways, bridges, tunnels, and dams, sewer systems, schools, civic monuments, theaters, and airports. For most of us, there probably isn't a day on which we're not driving, flying, playing, learning, or teaching, or flushing on a structure or a system built by the New Deal. The internet itself, on which we all depend today as if it's a utility, and which you here in this audience do your best every day to make even more useful to the rest of us, that was the creation of a government program that followed the precepts about building public infrastructure that had first been laid down by the New Deal. The idea that when something needs to be built that private enterprise can't build or won't build, then the federal government has an obligation to step in and pick up the slack. Because these efforts it's not really only about spending, it's about investment. And that's just one of the ways that the New Deal still resonates for us today. The New Deal was so diverse because it was the product of an amazingly diverse team of advisors, some of whom are remembered today only as names in dry history texts, some of whom have been completely forgotten. One of the ways I try in my book to recapture the reality, the grassroots, ground-level reality of the New Deal for modern readers is to try to bring these people back to life. So there's Frances Perkins, the first female cabinet secretary in American history, who almost single-handedly brought Social Security into being, and who on her first day as Secretary of Labor not only had to physically evict the cigar-chomping gangsters with whom Herbert Hoover had staffed his labor department, but then she literally took mop in hand with her secretary to evict the cockroaches from the Labor Department's filthy headquarters in a dank corner of Washington, D.C. Harold Ickes, FDR's Interior Secretary and the head of his Public Works Administration, He was a Republican, but a progressive Republican, who had staged a Dump Hoover campaign at the 1932 Republican Convention, but the campaign failed because he couldn't find anyone else who wanted to run in a year when the Republican candidate was almost certain to get trounced. And then there's my personal favorite, General Hugh Johnson, a big, blustery, often drunk, profane ex-West Pointer who brought the NRA into being, the National Recovery Administration. He created its symbol of the Blue Eagle, which some of you may know about, and he was famous for intimidating the nation's most important industrialists into doing his bidding when he wasn't secretly checking into Walter Reed Hospital to dry out. Well, how big a figure was General Hugh Johnson in his day? In 1933, the first year of the New Deal, he, not FDR, was Time Magazine's Man of the Year. Today, almost nobody even remembers his name. Yet, of course, the center of all this activity, the hub of it, was FDR. Like Barack Obama, he was viewed as rather an untested cipher when he took office. The X in the equation, as the editorialist William Allen White described him after the election. Roosevelt was so adept at making himself seem all things to all people that when you read the memoirs of his closest aides, you can sense their love and their devotion to the man, but also their uncertainty about what he really has in mind. And I think that explains why so many of them who had devoted years of their lives to serving him ended up deeply disaffected with him. They started out working for the FDR they had in their minds, only to find out that when political expediency called, he could turn into somebody completely different. Now, that wasn't the way the public thought about him. After years in which the national leadership hadn't seemed to have tried anything in this crisis, Roosevelt's pledge, uttered in his magically mellifluous voice, delivered confidence. So much so that for most of the next 6 years, the country went along with him, even when it was obvious that one initiative or another had failed. And that's one important fact about the New Deal that I think has also been forgotten, and that's that some of it worked and some of it quite distinctly did not work. But what underlied the whole effort, the unifying principle and the lasting legacy of this huge, often disorganized, and often incredibly messy program, if you could even call it a program, it was the idea that the federal government's responsibility was to do something, not merely stand aside, to make sure that unemployed Americans had something to eat and a roof over their heads and opportunity for work, even while the private sector wasn't up to providing it. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal created the template for federal efforts to improve the lot of all Americans, regardless of their station. In the furnace of the Great Depression, the Roosevelt administration forged a new style of government and a new vision of its responsibilities to its citizens. But let's step back for a couple of minutes right now and talk a little bit more about what the New Deal was not. In fact, one of the most important lessons I learned while researching my book is that today both conservatives and liberals get the New Deal wrong. To begin with, it wasn't really a program in the sense that a program is a collection of interconnected pieces, every step bearing a definite relationship to every other step. Now, those words I just quoted, that was how FDR actually described the New Deal in a fireside chat in 1935, but he was fibbing. It was much more haphazard than that, often made up of policies and programs designed on the spot to put out a fire. As his close friend and the speechwriter Raymond Moley observed many years later when he was disaffected, Moley said, "To look upon these policies as the result of a unified plan would be to believe that the accumulation of stuffed snakes, baseball pictures, school flags, old tennis shoes, carpenter tools, geometry books, and chemistry sets in a boy's bedroom could have been put there by an interior decorator." Indeed, although the New Deal is pictured today as an entirely liberal and progressive program, in fact, many of its initiatives were staunchly conservative. Sure, the first law passed during the 100 days, those first 3 months of the new administration, imposed new regulations on the banking industry. But the very second piece of legislation was the Economy Act, which mandated a 25% cut in the federal budget including cuts to congressional pay, federal employees' wages, and veterans' benefits, and sharp cutbacks in federal employment. Roosevelt constantly threatened to raise taxes on business and the wealthy, but he failed to do so until the very end of the New Deal period. For most of that time, the bulk of federal taxes was paid by the middle class and the working class, and more taxes were piled on them every year, including higher excise levies on cosmetics, tobaccos, and after the repeal of Prohibition in 1933, on liquor. Many New Deal initiatives favored by Roosevelt were failures, and many of its successes were conceived by others. The New Deal's first great triumph that we just talked about, the ending of the banking crisis during the administration's first weeks in office, was mapped out not by New Dealers, but by Herbert Hoover's own economic team in his Treasury Department. FDR was opposed to adding old age pensions to Social Security until the very eve of the bill's introduction. He threatened to veto a bank regulation bill if it included deposit insurance, but he was overruled in that one by Congress. Now, in time, he would claim paternity of both programs, Social Security and deposit insurance, which is an indication of his ability to recognize what was working and his political suppleness and his intention to take credit for what did work. His reputation as the quintessential tax and spend liberal is also misplaced. He pushed for a balanced federal budget every year, though he never achieved one. He was skeptical of large public works programs, and he even vetoed bills that he thought would give him too much unrestricted spending authority. He detested programs he thought would result in too much redistribution of wealth. These he dismissed as the nearest thing to a dole, including, once again, Social Security. The New Deal under Roosevelt may have forged an alliance between minority voters and the Democratic Party that has lasted right up to the present day, but its worst shortcomings were in the field of racial equality. Many of its work relief programs perpetuated racial discrimination and shortchanged black families, and even widened the gulf in wages between black workers and white workers. When black leaders came to the White House to urge FDR to speak out against a wave of lynchings across the South and in the West, he refused, and he even refused to press for an anti-lynching bill, giving its sponsor, the NAACP, a baldly political explanation. He said the bill would so anger Southern congressional conservatives that their threatened filibusters would jeopardize the rest of his program, and he said he thought the country could not afford that. He enjoyed a Democratic majority in Congress throughout the New Deal, but that's not the same as saying that it was a New Deal majority. In fact, the harshest opposition from his program came from those same Southern conservatives in his own party, while some of his most dependable supporters were progressive Republicans. His delicate triangulation between the liberal and conservative blocs in Congress outraged progressives in his era, just as Obama's political compromises outrage progressives today. Think about this. The Securities Act of 1934, which gave us the Securities and Exchange Commission, which made corporate reporting much more transparent, was considered by progressives at the time to amount to a total giveaway to Wall Street. The New Republic, which was then even much more progressive than it is today, greeted the final draft with the words, "The stock exchange should remember Franklin Roosevelt with gratitude." So this points us toward a question still being debated today, which is whether the New Deal ended the Depression, or as some would have it, whether it prolonged the Depression. So here are a few facts. The facts are that by the estimation of mainstream economists, the Great Depression ended sometime around 1935, mid-1935. The U.S. economy, measured by real gross national product, grew at a blistering pace, averaging 8% a year between 1933, when Roosevelt took office, and 1937. That, by the way, is more than 4 times the economic growth rate we're experiencing today. The unemployment rate fell sharply from an estimated 23% in 1932, Hoover's last year in office, to 9% in 1937. The nation's employment rolls grew by nearly 10 million workers in that period, and that was an increase of 25% in the labor force. The stock market, too, reacted very positively. From Roosevelt's inauguration to early 1937, the Dow Jones average nearly quadrupled, a record unmatched in any other four-year span in history. Now, liberal economists would love to see this as a triumph of deficit-funded fiscal stimulus in the tradition of John Maynard Keynes, but the truth is that for the most part, the New Deal achieved this record without explicit Keynesian pump priming. In fact, the renowned economist E. Cary Brown made a famous remark in the 50s that fiscal stimulus was unsuccessful during the 30s, not because it did not work, but because it was not even tried. Indeed, for most of the New Deal, stimulative programs were almost always paired with counter-stimulative programs. In the parlance of those times, inflationary programs were paired with deflationary ones. Work relief was paired with the Economy Act. Public works with higher excise taxes. Measures to push up prices for farm commodities were paired with industrial price fixing under General Johnson's NRA, which made the crisis on the farm, by the way, much, much more severe. The unemployment assistance provisions of the Social Security Act were countered by the new Social Security tax that went into effect in 1937, another working class tax. It was not until 1938, when FDR had to address a sudden, sharp recession, did the New Deal implement an explicit stimulus program of large-scale public works and work relief and unemployment relief of the sort we think of today as stimulus. Well, that program stopped that recession in its tracks and set the stage for an even sharper recovery, one of the strongest in American history. Now, that's not to say that the New Deal did not significantly boost federal spending. The budgetary outflow rose by nearly half as a percentage of GDP between 1932 and 1939. Measured the same way as a share of GDP, the federal budget deficit increased 12-fold. The notion that the Depression didn't end until World War II derives from the fact that spending and the deficit both soared even more between 1941 and 1945, but the trend of increases had started much earlier, starting in 1933. Yet the New Dealers didn't really think of their spending as stimulus the way we would today. There were New Dealers who were followers of John Maynard Keynes, who pressed for much, much more, but they were largely ignored. Roosevelt and his inner circle thought their spending programs, especially work relief and government construction, were a way to keep the unemployed fed and housed and spending money to buy time while they tried everything else they could to instill recovery, and incidentally, in the hopes that the recovery might cure its own disease. But all of this certainly had a stimulative effect, even if they didn't think of it that way. So thus far, we've talked about the economic context of the New Deal and some of the specific initiatives it put in place. What about the political context? I'd like to spend some time on that because I think Roosevelt's approach to his political environment has much to teach Barack Obama and the rest of us. There was a major difference between the political environment of the New Deal and today's. In the 30s, both parties, Democrats and Republicans, had very strong progressive or liberal wings. In fact, one of the strongest progressives in Congress in the 30s was California's own senior senator, Hiram Johnson, who we think of today as the man who, as governor, gave us the initiative process. But Johnson was a Republican. In fact, he'd run for vice president in 1912 with Teddy Roosevelt on the Progressive Party or Bull Moose ticket. Both parties also had very strong conservative wings. For the Democrats, it was that block of senators and congressmen from the Solid South, some of whom would splinter off from the Democratic Party and form the Dixiecrats and run Strom Thurmond for president in 1948. FDR also faced implacable antagonism from big business, which complained that he was creating uncertainty in the industrial economy from all his regulating of child labor and stock and bond trading and bank practices and food and drug safety. And I think we've all heard echoes of that very same point today. Today, liberals complain about the conservative echo chamber, the influence of Fox News, for example. Now, of course, there wasn't a Fox News in the 1930s, but the same role was played by the newspaper industry of that era, which was almost entirely controlled by conservative businessmen, whose editorial pages would sometimes, if you read them today, you would think that Fox News was mild. FDR was a master at bringing the fight to his opponents, especially those in big business and Wall Street. His speeches are filled with blistering comebacks against attacks on him by businessmen and bankers. Think about how he responded to the formation of the American Liberty League by conservative Democratic financiers, including the DuPont family. The League had announced as its two founding principles, one, to teach the necessity of respect for the rights of property, and two, to teach the duty of government to encourage and protect free enterprise. Well, Roosevelt's opinion of the League was withering. He described it as, and I'm quoting him here, an organization that only advocates 2 out of the 10 commandments. He said, the 2 particular tenets of this organization say, you shall love God, but forget your neighbor. But the concerns of government, he continued, besides those 2 points, are about people who want to keep themselves free from starvation, keep a roof over their heads, lead decent lives, have proper educational standards. The concern of government is the protection of life and the liberty of the individual against elements in the community that seek to enrich and advance themselves at the expense of their fellow citizens. So in public, he never ceased to challenge those moneyed interests. In perhaps his most famous speech in this vein, one that I quoted when I started my talk, he said, and I quote him again, "Tonight I call the roll of millions who never had a chance, men at starvation wages, women in sweatshops, children at looms, the names of farmers whose acres yielded only bitterness, businessmen whose books were portents of disaster, homeowners who were faced with eviction, frugal citizens whose savings were insecure. We will continue to seek to improve working conditions for the workers of America, to reduce hours over long, to increase wages that spell starvation, to end the labor of children, to wipe out sweatshops. We will continue every effort to end monopoly in business, support collective bargaining, stop unfair competition, to abolish dishonorable trade practices. For all these, we have only just begun to fight." Now, I don't think it's right to criticize President Obama for not being Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt was a unique political figure with a unique talent for reaching out with his voice from the radio speakers in millions of homes and holding his audience's attention. Plus, obviously, times have changed and we changed with them. And despite the surface similarities between the Great Depression and the crash of 1929 on the one hand, and the crash of 2008 and the Great Recession on the other, there are important differences. For one thing, let's not forget that by the time FDR was inaugurated, the Depression had been going on for nearly 4 years, and as I said, in the Farm Belt, more than 10 years. The Depression was so long and so deep that skepticism, even hatred, for Wall Street had become profoundly ingrained in the American psychology. And that was reinforced by a very aggressive investigation staged by the Senate Finance Committee under its chief counsel, Ferdinand Pecora. The Pecora hearings in 1933 laid out for everybody to see how the nation's biggest bankers had connived to cheat the little man out of his life savings, while the biggest banks got more and more profitable and, by the way, paid no income taxes. Well, quite frankly, the recession of 2008 didn't last long enough to create the same effect. More to the point, government wasn't stuck without a strategy as it had been in 1929. The strategy in 2008 came mostly from the New Deal playbook. Spend to keep people from starving, stimulate the economy with public works, and rely on the social safety net, unemployment, Social Security, work relief that was introduced under the New Deal. So the financial industry, which had every bit as much to do with the crash of 2008 as it did with the crash of 1929, has been able to evade regulations quite as stringent as they were faced with in the 1930s. Maybe it's that the public has become so used to bankers making huge salaries and bonuses that it's hard to get people stirred up anymore. Certainly, the administration that came into office on the heels of this terrible economic crash in 2008 hasn't made the financial industry and the economic imbalances and inefficiencies in the economy much of a target. Now, maybe that'll change if Occupy Wall Street gains more traction, but so far, the administration, I think, has done little more than pay lip service to the need for a really significant restructuring of our financial industry as the New Deal did. Or it may be that President Obama simply doesn't have the gift that FDR did at putting his policies into words and images that the average American can understand. Because even when he had to tell voters that the job of reversing the misery of the Depression was an unfinished job, Roosevelt continually reminded them of everything the New Deal had accomplished. A record, by the way, that I think resembles Obama's passage of health care reform and the stimulus plan in terms of shaking up the status quo. In 1938, when Roosevelt proposed that sweeping stimulus program I mentioned to stem a new recession, he observed in a fireside chat that although unemployment was still too high and economic growth still too slow, the real despair of the Depression was already a thing of the past. In other words, the New Deal worked. The recession has not returned us to the disasters and suffering of the beginning of 1933, he reminded his listeners. Your money in the bank is safe. Farmers are no longer in deep distress and have greater purchasing power. The dangers of security speculation have been minimized. National income is almost 50% higher than it was in 1932. And here's the most important point he mentioned. Government has an established and accepted responsibility for relief. Now, that last point is another one that FDR repeated over and over again, the importance and the responsibility of government action. And here's how he put it in a fireside chat in 1937. I've never had sympathy with the point of view that a session of the Congress is an unfortunate intrusion of what they call politics into our national affairs. Democratic government can never be considered an intruder into the affairs of a democratic nation. And I hope we all understand, as he did, the necessity of preserving the principles of American government that he introduced. Principles that have remained under attack literally ever since. Even if we disagree over the specific policies, that principle is important. So I want to spend the last few minutes of my time putting those attacks in perspective. We can tell that story through Social Security, which was the cornerstone of the New Deal, and to this day, I think, still stands as a jewel in its crown. We keep hearing today that Social Security is going bankrupt, that it doesn't really have any money, that it's a Ponzi scheme in which today's workers simply put in money so that today's retirees can take it out. It's a monstrous lie, to quote Rick Perry. We're told that Social Security's drafters had no idea that there would be so many elderly people in the United States by 2011, and that Social Security was enacted at a time when the life expectancy of Americans was less than 65, so the drafters thought that no one would ever have to collect. Well, I can tell you that none of those things is true. Everything that's happened since the creation of Social Security in 1935 was foreseen by its founders and provided for. They forecast that the elderly population of the United States would reach 12.5% of the total population by 1980. In fact, they overestimated it. The real figure was only about 11%. They provided for frequent tweaks to the tax rate, the retirement age, and many other factors so that Social Security would always be there for coming generations and would be adjusted to meet demographic and economic realities they could only guess at. And their faith was repeated by many of the administrations that followed FDR, Republicans and Democrats alike, by Truman, Eisenhower. Eisenhower enacted the biggest expansion of Social Security of all, Lyndon Johnson and Ronald Reagan. Those presidents all understood that the enemies of Social Security would continually warn younger generations that they shouldn't depend on the program, that they should put their trust instead in Wall Street. But they also understood that Wall Street wasn't infallible, and when it failed, all Americans would still need a safety net to fall back on. And that's been proven again and again, most recently over the last few years. Those presidents all kept faith with the core principle of the New Deal as it was expressed in Social Security, that there's no getting away from our shared responsibility for one another, the shared responsibility that was the beating heart of the New Deal. And that's a principle that the drafters of Social Security understood very well. Here's the way Edwin Witt, the chief of the drafting team for Social Security, told Congress when it was considering the bill. Whether the aged are supported by their children or by society, the economic price will have to be paid because the money expended by families in support of their elders is money unavailable for the new generation support or for investment and growth. Whether you enact pension laws or not, that cost is there. The growing number of old people will have to be supported by the generation then living, and whether you do it in the form of pensions or in some other way, there's no way of escaping that cost. And I think that reinforces that the great virtue of Social Security is that it made the older generation, every older generation, independent. And that's important not only for our elders, but for ourselves and our children who are freed to a great extent from the financial burden of supporting the older generation. And that's important for the economy. So the phase of American government that died in 1929 and led to the Great Depression and ultimately to the New Deal was a phase that had been created in the 19th century and that had proven itself in the 1920s and the 1930s to be unequal to the responsibilities of the 20th century and certainly even more unequal to the demands of the 21st century. What we discovered in 1929 is that society doesn't save any money by moving the bill around from government to the individual, and that doing so can cost lives. The lesson we learned was that we're all in this together, and that a policy based on telling people that they're on their own benefits only a very small portion of the population. The elements in the community, as FDR called them, who seek to enrich and advance themselves at the expense of their fellow citizens. And the question that I'll leave you with right now is, why do we keep having to learn that lesson over and over again? And since that's a question that I don't think I can answer standing here, we can't answer right on today, I'll open the floor now to questions that I hope I can answer.
Anyone have a question?
Could you describe the difference in the way that a bill is? Oh, sorry. Can you describe the difference in the way that a bill would be passed, sort of the political environment between then and now? Do you understand my question?
Yeah, I think I do. As I mentioned, the political environment in Congress was much different then. And the economic environment was different. So during the 1930s, particularly at the beginning of the New Deal period, we mentioned the 100 days. This went on for several more years. There was much more willingness in Congress to do what the administration wanted. A lot of the bills that became part of the New Deal were generated out of the White House in a way that we don't see as much anymore. Now, much more we see legislation created in Congress, maybe with consultation with the White House, maybe not. But that tells you that there's a lot more skepticism between the White House and Congress today than there was then. Now, in time, by about 1936, 1937, the balance shifted a little bit more toward Congress, and Roosevelt faced a lot more opposition to the legislation he was trying to put over. There were sessions of Congress in which almost none of the bills that the Roosevelt White House proposed got passed. And there were several reasons for that. One was economic conditions had improved. There wasn't that fear and desperation in Congress that existed when Roosevelt first came to office. So there was less willingness to let the White House completely have its own way. Also, people had gotten a little bit tired of the New Deal. They'd gotten tired of Roosevelt generating all this legislation, and there was a natural sense of pushback. But certainly for the first few years of his administration, he really had the ability to have his way with Congress, much more than I think any president, certainly the current president, does today. And of course, you didn't have an intransigent bloc in Congress the way you do now that's in a position to block a lot of legislation.
I guess returning a bit to Social Security, and recently they had the reduction in the Social Security tax rates. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I have negative thoughts about it. The Social Security tax was instituted. It was a conscious plan to give the public what they would think of as a stake in Social Security. Now, it started out as 1% of payroll. Now, of course, it's 6.2% plus the 6.2% that employers pay. But this is a very important element of Social Security because it's a dedicated revenue stream. It's always there. Even if no other money comes into the system, that's going to be enough to pay for all benefits right up from now right up till at least 2030, and even then it will be enough to pay for 80% of the benefits that are currently scheduled. The danger of cutting the payroll tax as a way of putting money into the pockets of the working class is that now you've raised question about whether that money is ever going to be paid back into the system, and you've introduced doubt about whether the payroll tax is really stable. And I think that's a bad idea. I've written about this in my newspaper column. And what I said is there's a lot of good in giving the middle class and the working class a tax cut, but there are real dangers in doing it through the payroll tax. It could have been done in many other ways. So it's good for the consuming class to have more money in their pockets, but it's a real danger to Social Security to chip away at this important bedrock.
What are your thoughts on Herman Cain's 999 plan?
Well, I proposed to my editors that I do a column sometime in the next few days or week about the eternal popularity of tax nostrums in American politics. These things never pencil out. I mean, I think now that Cain has gotten some traction as a potential Republican candidate for president, people have taken a very close look at the 999 proposal, 9% flat income tax, 9% corporate tax, 9% sales tax. It doesn't pencil out. It would represent a huge burden on the middle class and the working class. It wouldn't leave any room to raise taxes. State taxes, it would require the destruction of Social Security and Medicare. It simply, the numbers simply don't work. And we see this again and again. The flat tax was popular among Republican candidates 10 years ago. That didn't pencil out because the amount of money it raised would simply not support the government. Going way back into the 30s, Huey Long, who was governor of Louisiana and senator from Louisiana, and until his assassination in 1935, a really scary prospect that he would run against Roosevelt for the Democratic nomination. He had a plan called Every Man a King, or the Share Our Wealth plan, in which all incomes over $1 million and all wealth, family wealth, over $5 million would be taxed to zero. And all that money would then be applied to government programs, mostly to help the working class. The numbers didn't work out. They just you can't have a system in which you place those sorts of strict limits on taxation and have it support the government that we have. So, I think Cain's plan is sort of the offspring of that habit.
So I think you mentioned that the introduction of Social Security and the forefathers that introduced Social Security foresaw a dynamic in population growth as well as a dynamic in the sustainability of the program. However, the fact still remains that the percentage of older individuals compared to the age, the retirement age, hasn't necessarily kept pace with one another. And so as we have disproportionately more baby boomers retire over time, as well as sort of, as you just mentioned, the decrease in the amount of money that's going in, that's clearly, a bubble that's waiting to burst, not much unlike any other bubble that we have seen. So what are your thoughts in terms of how we can potentially address it, or if at the inception of Social Security, they actually considered such instances, or sort of the reluctance of modern government to actually increase the age, so that it's not that disproportionate from when it was when Social Security really was sort of a minimum safety net as opposed to a social program.
Well, they certainly foresaw that there were going to be changes that they could not predict. And that's why they built into the system various safety valves. The retirement age could be changed, level of taxation could be changed, benefits could be changed. Of course, we've seen a huge expansion of Social Security well beyond what was enacted in 1935 since then, and that accounts in part for the reason that we all pay much more for it. Now, the question of the retirement age is I think, it's a complicated one, certainly much more complicated than a lot of its proponents would like us to believe. Yes, it's true. On average, we are living longer. On average, we are working longer. But the vast majority of retirees today still retire not at 65, but at 62. And they take lower monthly benefits from Social Security, but they start earlier. When you start looking at changes in longevity, changes in working habits, and in life expectancy, it's not a bad idea to take another look at the standard retirement age of 65. But we have to keep in mind that that's a broad average, and raising the retirement age would have very different effects on very different classes of retirees. It would have different effects on working class retirees compared to professional retirees. It has different effects on black and other minorities than it does on white males and white women. Plus, we don't know that what we've seen of is a pretty steady rise in longevity is going to continue. We all know trees don't grow to heaven. My son, who's 3 feet tall when he's 7, isn't going to be 21 feet tall when he's 21. It's not a bad idea to keep an eye on retirement age, but if we make those sorts of changes, they should be subject to dynamic changes. In other words, maybe raise and lower the retirement age based on what the trend has been over the previous 10 years. None of this requires a major tweak to Social Security, and that's a message that I think is very important. Social Security as a program is fiscally very, very healthy. There's money in there that has been put in there since 1982. The trust fund has been built up to accommodate the baby boomers. The baby boom is a bulge. It's not going to last forever. It's going to run from about now through about 2035, maybe 2040. And then the demographics of this country are going to be very different. So I'm in favor of necessary tweaks, but we have to keep in mind that the program is healthy and it's structured very well, and these changes need to be modest and not draconian. I think there's a question.
Yeah, it sounded like one of the features of the New Deal era was this kind of, scattershot assemblage of programs, some of which worked out, some of which didn't. What were the factors that made that politically possible, whereas now we seem to get these kind of omnibus stimulus bills that, of course, no one can afford to say is not working, and then we need to try a plan B, right?
Well, I think some of the major elements were, first of all, there was no template at the time. So anything that was tried under the Roosevelt administration was necessarily going to be new. And he had signaled, as I mentioned, that he was willing to try everything. And if something didn't work, he had already said, we're not going to be embarrassed by it. We're not going to be ashamed. We're not going to apologize. We're simply going to go on to the next thing. In fact, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which was a major bill to help the Farm Belt, had written into it every one of about 10 possible approaches to fixing the farm that anyone had proposed. And basically, they wrote it all and they said, the Secretary of Agriculture, you can try any of these. we're not going to hold you to anyone. We're not going to dictate what you do. So there was a much looser approach to government programming then than there is now. Now, in part, we're different now because we can look back on the New Deal and 70 or 80 years since then, and we do have a better idea of the principles that work. And of course, we have more experience with some of these programs that we've tried and that have survived. So the political environment is very different, but our experience in the country is also very different from what we had in 1933 when it was basically nobody had any ideas, so we're going to try everything, and if something works, we'll keep it.
Can you talk a little bit more about the liberal wing of the Republican Party in the 30s? I mean, how much political power did they have? How sizable was that wing, and what was their mix of principles?
Well, it was a very sizable wing, and they tended to align themselves with progressive Democrats, but some of the most powerful senators, Republican senators and congressmen at the time were progressive Republicans. It was a very strong tradition in the Republican Party. It dated back to Theodore Roosevelt, who splintered off into the Progressive Party because he thought that the Republicans weren't progressive enough. So it was respected. Hiram Johnson was a dean of the U.S. Senate, a progressive Republican senator from California, and they were very important supporters of the New Deal. They were particularly important because they didn't have partisan buy-in to the New Deal. The New Deal, I understood, was a democratic series of programs. They were Republicans, but they did want to uphold the progressive tradition. So you would see them forming voting blocs with Democrats. And of course, and the Democrats, I should say, not only progressives supported the New Deal, but many of the conservatives were forced to do so as well for partisan reasons. So you had, at least through the mid-30s, very powerful coalition in Congress, progressive Republicans, progressive Democrats, moderate Democrats, and Democratic Party regulars, so even if they were conservatives.
What's your opinion of like the government taking the position of, bailing out big business, and do you have thoughts around that?
The New Deal had a big bailout program of its own. This was under the leadership of a Texan banker named Jesse Jones, who was a Democrat. The New Deal thought it was very important to support the financial industry and support the banks. In fact, there were New Dealers who were more radical who said we should nationalize all the banks. Well, Roosevelt kept them at arm's length. What he wanted to do was deal with the abuses and the weaknesses in the system. So he did that. $60 billion in federal money went into bailouts for major banks, investment banks, and other financial institutions through the New Deal. It's clearly something that needs to be done. In 2008, when we bailed out the banks, the alternative was the potential for total financial collapse. It had to be done. Now, I think the problems that we've seen with the way the bailout was administered or the way the bailout was set up, and these are, I think, problems that are quite appropriately being raised by Occupy Wall Street, is that it wasn't evenly handled. In other words, the banks got bailed out, but they got bailed out without strings attached. There wasn't a requirement for how they should renegotiate mortgages that were facing foreclosure. There wasn't a requirement for how they should invest all the capital they were getting from the federal government, put it back out in assets through lending to businesses and what have you. And that's been the disconnect that I think that we're now finally seeing being moved up to the front burner, at least politically, in part because of these protests in New York and other cities. But it's something that really, that I think a lot of people saw early on in 2008, that this was going to be a flaw and it needed to be corrected, and it still does.
Thanks very much, Michael.
Thank you. My pleasure.